Hi, everybody. Welcome to our presentation this evening on the Mackinaw jacket, a Canadian folk costume. My name is Lindsay. I'm the History Programming Coordinator here at the museum. And it is my pleasure to welcome John Savage, who is the creator of the installation that you're seeing across from me on our third screen here. We've worked with John before, but John approached us about putting together an installation about the Mackinaw jacket and the ties that it has to Aurelia and the importance it has as a garment all across Canada. And I was so lucky to get to know this story through John. It just kind of worked out really well, actually, because we were already planning an exhibit about a lumber magnate from Aurelia's past, whose in-laws were the Carse family, who you will learn about later on this evening. And so we paired them together. So that's what you're seeing on your screen there. So John has been kind enough to join us this evening to tell us the story of the Mackinaw jacket. And it really is an amazing history. So John, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you. And I just want to thank the museum again for hosting one of my exhibits and presentations, because I think you guys have done a lot as a small museum to reach out and to listen to your Indigenous contributors. And I know that at times we've had to have a dialogue about about the needs of the Indigenous community to tell their own story. And that's really important for us. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. We're glad to have you here with us. So the way this is going to run this evening, folks, is I have some questions in front of me to prompt John as he goes through the talk. We're going to have a nice casual discussion about this amazing history. And then we're going to do a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, try to save them until later on. You will see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, you can submit them there and we'll pose them to John later on in the talk. So without further ado, should we get started, John?
Great, sure.
Okay, amazing. So the first question that I have for you, maybe a little bit unfair because it's a massive question. Can you introduce us to the Mackinaw jacket and tell us the story of the creation of this garment?
Okay, so to start off, the Mackinaw jacket is part of a 400-year-old blanket coat tradition in Canada. And this tradition started out almost right from the beginning in the 1600s, when the Europeans had to trade things for fur pelts in the fur trade. So they found that there was a demand for utilitarian pots and pans and cutlery, or utensils and axes and things like that. But there was also a need for wool blankets. And these wool blankets would replace blankets that could be worn made out of roots and fibers. Out west, there was in BC, there were blankets made out of the hair of, or the wool of dogs, little dogs that they would breed for their curly, warm hair that they could harvest from their bellies and weave into what were, Cowichan type sweaters and blankets. So there was a long tradition of wearing blankets, but the wool blankets that would come from Europe were of higher quality. So the demand was there. So this was something that the Europeans could trade with the First Nations. And the First Nations often would request different designs and colors. So you had certain colors more popular with certain groups or designs, and even the thicknesses and weaves. So For example, the thicker blankets of what was near where the Mackinaw jacket was being developed, those later would be adapted quite well into coats. So here we see in this photo, or this old photo here, we see it looks like a chief dressed up in his chief's costume or regalia, which was looked like a beaver felt top hat, and I can see maybe a blanket used there as well. The fellow to our right there is wearing a capote. And a capote was a kind of a cloak with a hood, with arms, with sleeves. And this was originally fashioned after the French sailors that would come into Canada. So these blanket coats evolved into capotes. Here we have an image by the artist Cornelius Krieghoff, which many people would probably know. And this is a woman that's selling moccasins, and she's going to market with a blanket wrapped around her. So, you know, this is a common way you would use that blanket. You might even use that blanket later for sleeping on as well. Now, how the Mackinaw coat, or sometimes it's called the Mackinaw jacket, got started. Well, it was also building upon the blanket, or the designs that were in the area at the time. There was a Métis and First Nation community there. It's at this. So when I say Mackinaw, I mean Michilimack, or there's which means Turtle Island. So Michilimackinaw is the French variation of the Odawa term, and then that's at the Straits of Upper Lake Huron on the western tip of it, where it flows into Michigan, Lake Michigan. So right around there, that was a narrows. That would have been a natural place for a lot of people who were traveling between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and then Lake Huron connecting to the Ottawa River, and the Ottawa River connecting down to the St. Lawrence, where they could trade with Europe. So this area became a very intense area. It was with a lot of population, but also there were infections as well that could wipe out the community. So right around in the 17th and 18th century, the French had established a fort on the mainland there, and Fort Michilimackinac. And these are the kinds of costumes you would have seen coming and going from there. And so you see in the middle there, you see a chief in his regalia, and it looks like he's wearing what you would call a frock coat. It's a tailored coat with a sash around the waist, used as a belt, and that would be patterned after the French military designs. So it was one way of distinguishing yourself as a chief, and we'll see a slide later on where that's the case too. And then you would see different kinds of shirts with frills. Now, the thing about Indigenous people back then, or the First Nations, is they already had a tradition of sewing. They would make all sorts of garments. They would make moccasins, they would make leggings, they would make different cloaks. So this wasn't new to them. But what was new to them were the different kinds of designs and fibers and colors that the Europeans could trade with them for. So this would have been, these costumes are the typical kinds you might see around the fort, where there was a fur trading post as well. And again, on the right, you see a fellow there wearing what looks like maybe a buckskin underneath a Hudson Bay blanket or a Northwest Company blanket there. So the island that I'm talking about, here it's called Mackinac, but it's actually pronounced Mackinaw because the French, they leave the C silent. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like a turtle. So it's Turtle Island, you know. That's what the origin of the name is from. So it was the original Turtle Island, and this is where, you know, they had the French had a fort, then the British took that over after Treaty of Paris in 1763, and then after the War of Independence, it was handed over to the Americans when they drew the boundaries, and then in the War of 1812, that was the site of the first battle that our Canadian side won. When the battles broke out, or when the war broke out, it was supposedly the most unpopular war America's ever led in terms of popular support from the beginning. It was also called Madison's War. He thought he could walk into Canada with open arms, and maybe they might have a big parade like Putin thought he could walk into Ukraine with. So I find it kind of interesting looking back then, because some of the similarities between what Canada went through and what Ukraine is going through, it's similar. It's a war that forged Canada. Before that, there were disparate groups. There was only about, I understand, about 1,800 British regulars that were in Canada at that time. They had to depend on the goodwill of their subjects, being the French that they had just won Lower and Upper Canada from, but also the First Nations and the Métis that lived in this area as well. So what happened was, after the war was declared, General Brock enlisted the help of a fellow named William McKay, I believe it is, and he paddled with his voyageurs in a dispatch canoe, one of the fastest ones. They could paddle do a stroke every second, so that's 60 strokes a minute, and they could go for 17 hours even. So they got up to where Captain Charles Roberts had a garrison, and this garrison was made up of British regulars. They were called the Veterans Battalion. So it was the 10th Royal Veterans Battalion. The old name for the Veterans Battalion was the Invalids Battalion. That was changed because it didn't sound so nice. It was a little bit insulting to the guys that were in it. But basically, it was older soldiers or those that were injured and that couldn't serve on the front lines of a battle anymore. And so they gave them this kind of light garrison duty in the hinterland. So this post that Captain Charles Roberts was in command of was called Fort St. Joseph. It was on St. Joseph Island in the St. Mary's River, just downstream from Sault Ste. Marie, where that is today. And it was like a day's paddle from Fort Mackinaw. And so after the War of Independence, the British garrison had moved from Fort Mackinaw to Fort St. Joseph. It was a very cold, windswept island. And the last time they had coats made coats that were supplied to them was 1807. So Captain Charles Roberts, upon seeing the last supply ship leaving in November, he wrote back on November 20th to his to headquarters back in Quebec, and said that, you know, he's desperate for these coats for his garrison. So he took the risk of contracting a Métis fellow. His name is John Askin Jr., who is the shopkeeper for the Indian department, to make some great coats for his contingent. And John Askin Jr. also took a risk because he had to take take credit for this. You know, this was all done on credit. There's a possibility that the British military wouldn't have paid for it. So he basically fashioned these great coats, and he even put in some little design features that made them look more military. And these were very, very popular because the thickness of the wool blankets in that area was just the right thickness for these coats. And they were full-length coats largely, but we call that the first Mackinaw coat, because the next step was pretty simple. So in July, on July 17th, Captain Roberts enlisted the help of his contingent, which was approximately 47 British soldiers. He enlisted, along with the help of William Mackay, 150 Canadian or Métis fur traders and voyageurs. Now, these fur traders, a lot of them lived in the area, and you see their names all over. These family names are still all over the place. I used to work in Killarney, and you see them in the graveyard there, and the people you meet them in the bars, they're still there. So these names are old Métis names. And they also enlisted these voyageurs that were passing through the area. And one of those voyageurs was my ancestor, Antoine Godard de la Pointe. I'll talk about him a bit later. He was 15 years old. The Northwest Company, which was the Montreal Fur Trading Company that operated in the area, they were short of voyageurs, so they started hiring younger and younger voyageurs. And Antoine was enlisted when he was 14 in Montreal, and he paddled all the way up to what is now Thunder Bay. And on the return trip in July, the War of 1812 broke out, and Captain Roberts enlisted him to help him on this first expedition against the American forces. So along with 300 Ojibwa or Chippewa, Ottawa, and another 110 Sioux, Menominee, and Winnebago, they took off in 70 war canoes and 10 bateaux and a schooner, and they arrived at Fort Mackinaw. And after firing just a few shots, the Americans surrendered, because Captain Roberts said to sent a message that, you know, I can stop my British forces from, if you're going to surrender in the middle of a battle in which your families are going to be involved. I can stop the British, and I know a little bit of French, so I think I could stop the French, but I'm not sure if I can stop the various First Nations, because I don't really know their language too well. And so anyway, that was enough to convince them to surrender. So they took over that fort, and it was relatively peaceful. I don't think anyone was killed, actually, but it was a great victory. And the significance for Canada right there, and this ties back to the Mackinaw coat and the importance of it as a symbol of Canada, is it was the first time that these different peoples that became Canada made a conscious decision that we would fight for this land together, and we would fight together as in our shared interest. Now, the British had a military interest, but the others had an interest in terms of the fur trade, and trying to protect their fur trade from the Americans coming up and taking it over, which is interesting, because Jacob Astor, who was the owner of the Southwest Fur Trading Company, he actually sent a message up to Fort St. Joseph as well to warn them about the war breaking out, because he was against the war even though he was an American. He had interests on both sides of the border, and he didn't want those compromised by President Madison's folly here. So anyway, one of the first things they had to do at Fort Mackinaw, getting ready for the fall with all these new warriors around the fort, is to clothe them. So they had to make more greatcoats out of these blankets. But one of the runners, and these are people that run messages back and forth, asked that the coat be cut just above the knee so that he could snowshoe through the snowdrifts more easily. And that actually became the more distinctive style of the Mackinaw coat in years to come, although you can still find the longer ones around too. So that shorter coat became very important. It was, now there's a couple of Métis connections there, influences there. So the coat, basically coming out of the First Nations tradition, using styles from Europe, and it was basically designed by, commissioned by John Askin Jr. and his French, possibly Métis wife, Madeleine Pelche Askin. And then seamstresses were about 10 of them, and they were a mix, they believe, of white and Métis women. So you get this interesting blend here. So the Mackinaw coat, it could be claimed its origins by Métis, British certainly, but also out of the First Nation and the French traditions of blanket coats. So here we see in this slide, we see later on the blanket coat, or in this case, it's kind of like a Quebec version of the Mackinaw coat, but very, very similar. The two kind of morphed together. This is a snowshoe club that was in Montreal. And the interesting thing about the snowshoe club, it was made up largely of British settlers that came to Montreal. And one of the things that the British settlers wanted to do was to adopt the identity of Canadians. They want to, they're part of the big British Empire, but they wanted to distinguish themselves from other parts of the British Empire. And one of the ways to do it was to go native, as you say. And one of the ways of going native would be to try and dress like the peoples that had been here before. So considering that at this point, the blanket coat tradition was 300 years, this is how they dressed, and they had a great time. I love this photograph because it just sort of exemplifies, I think, the spirit of the time. And here they are. It's a recreational use of the Mackinaw jacket or the blanket coat, and it's a form of Canadian identity appropriation. So it's one way that that newcomers to the land could blend in by wearing this coat, and a great way to wear it and stay warm. Here we have Lady Aberdeen, and she was the Governor General's wife. And when she came to Canada, she wrote an article about the blanket coat, and I'll read a little bit here. She wrote this article that was in the Montreal Daily Star on January 26, 1895. And she says, "There is a material made in Canada called the blanket cloth, which is admirably fitted for winter wear. It is in fact an adaptation of blanketing worn by the Indians and has been greatly in vogue among the merry tobogganers. But we are disposed to think that it is not sufficiently appreciated or worn by the general public. We think that the members of the government house staff never look so well as when they turn out in their dark blue blanket coats with the many colored scarves, which would have been sashes, woven in times gone by. The French peasants wound round their waists. It is a pity that a photograph of our own family, which is the one we see here, could not have been rendered in colors to illustrate the variety that may be obtained in these costumes." So there you go. Too bad for Lady Aberdeen that color film hadn't come out at that point, but it's an interesting image there, and there's a lot of different references she makes to blanket coats in other journals. But there she is in Ottawa. And the funny thing about Ottawa, it's on the kind of the boundary between Montreal, Upper Canada and the blanket coat tradition that's more around the Great Lakes. So there's a bit of an overlap, which we'll get into later. But some of their coats there were more of the French style. Now, after the War of 1812, what we have is they redraw the boundaries, and Fort Mackinaw is on the American side. And so they relocate to Fort Drummond on Drummond Island. And then a few years later in the 1820s, they realize, well, the border, actually, Drummond Island is actually on the American side too. And so a lot of the veterans of the War of 1812, so we have French Canadian voyageurs like my ancestor, we have Métis, we have First Nations, they disperse. Now this map shows the dispersal of the Métis from the Sault Ste. Marie, Drummond Island, Mackinaw Island area after 1815. And you see, which is really interesting, is a large number of them in the bottom right corner go to a place called Penetanguishene, which was a British military port. And the British wanted loyalists down there. So the best loyalists in that area were the Métis from that they had fought alongside with. So you also see that some of these people went towards Eastern Ontario. They would have traveled down through the North Bay area, Lake Nipissing, and down to Mattawa. And so some of their travels ended up that way. And with them, what they did was they brought the Mackinaw coat or the Mackinaw jacket with them. And so when consider the popularity of the Mackinaw coat and how it spread, it mirrors very closely the dispersal of the Great Lakes Métis to other areas in the Métis, what they call now the Métis Nation, which is kind of an area of boundaries, moving boundaries, because it's still being debated, that stretch all the way from Aurelia, perhaps at the lowest level, all the way up into northern British Columbia, maybe even the Yukon. So here is an interesting photo. This is Louis Riel wearing a Mackinaw coat. And this sort of ties in, well, how did the Mackinaw coat get to the Red River Valley? And one theory I have, so it's just a theory, it has to be proven still, but one of the battles that the contingent at Fort Mackinaw went, did an expedition to was down to a place called Prairie des Chiens, which was on the Mississippi River. Now the Mississippi River, that area was known for having a Métis community. And in that Métis community, my cousin Diane Goodor has been doing some family research on this. And we've found that there's a strong likelihood that Antoine's older brothers were living with his uncle down there, had migrated there, and were intermarrying in with the local Sioux population there. So his uncle was one of the first settlers of that area and was known as a translator, and which is kind of interesting because that's what later happened with Antoine's son. They became, or sons, they became translators, interpreters as well. So anyway, here's another picture. This shows a blanket coat, perhaps that was turned into a chieftain's coat. And here he is holding what looks like to be a giant shilling. So this is a shout out to my shilling cousins on the Rama, Chippewas Rama Reserve. And this is where some people believe that where Chief Big Shilling, our common ancestor with the Goodors and Shillings, may have got his name. So back then there were these peace medals handed out, and they would have been proudly worn by chiefs for good deeds done during wars or treaties or favors that they were given. And it was a symbol of friendship and a symbol of partnership in this new adventure that was becoming Canada. So anyway, there you go. That's another version of the blanket coat, but this one looks more British than it does French. Here's the grave headstone that we put up, the family, for Antoine Godor, or Antoine Godard de la Pointe. And he's not buried in this graveyard, but we just put the headstone there. And Mary's not buried there either. She's buried in a pioneer cemetery. And one of my cousins, Joe Gesso, thinks that Antoine might be buried under the hockey arena in Rama. So anyway, there you go. But it's an interesting story. She ended up being buried with the white pioneers, and he ended up being buried with his Chippewa in-laws. And that's kind of the story there. So Antoine, anyway, he would have brought his Mackinaw coat to the area. He was a fur trader, and so that would have been one of the staple items he could have been trading throughout his region. He had to trade furs for items, and wool was a wool coat would have been a very good thing to trade with his Chippewa trading partners. So because he married Chief Big Shilling's daughter, Mary Shilling, he had access to a fur trade area that would have stretched from Newmarket or Holland Landing all the way up to Lake Nipissing and Killarney, perhaps, and including Muskoka, which was named after the great chief Yellowhead. So
John, on that note, how did you actually become interested in the story of the Mackinaw jacket?
Well, I think I became interested in it unconsciously. So as a kid, I just remember seeing people walking around wearing, buffalo check shirts. It was kind of a style that you saw in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and it just carried on. And then you'd see all sorts of different people wearing it. And lumberjacks. But I also remember like a lot of my relations there in Aurelia, they had their own Mackinaw coats. So here's one that was worn by my great grandfather, and it was similar to the ones that my grandfather's cousins would wear. And one of my cousins was saying that his dad had one hanging on the hook by the door. That would have been Reggie Godor. And this one was owned by my great grandfather, as you see in that picture there. He was a professional rower and of international acclaim. He was the North American sculling champion in 1902, it says there. I later found out through doing research that he was also a professional wrestler, and he also established different sports clubs around North America, including Port Hope, and in Aylmer, Quebec here, he started up what became, I believe, the Champlain Golf Club. So anyway, that's kind of neat. Like his Métis forebears, he traveled around a lot, and Aurelia was his kind of a base of operations, which he would circle back to every few years or every so often during the season. So yeah.
And of course, Charles, not the only famous rowing Godor, eh?
No, in our family line, it's just Charles. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. His older brother Jake got him into rowing. In fact, all the brothers were involved in some form of professional rowing, but Jake was the most successful. And Jake was perhaps the first Indigenous international sports figure, which hasn't been recognized that much. But he was back in the late 1890s and early 1900s. He was the world champion in sculling, and he was known as one of the fastest of his generation. And him and Charles would often row doubles together, or in fours or quads. So yeah, so they were that was the family profession. It was easier than logging, let's say, because they did build a lot of their muscle up, they say, from working in the bush. And
Yeah.
they also did a lot of fishing guiding and hunting guiding as well. The family story, how else I got interested in it was a couple other reasons. First of all, I remember my grandmother handing me this coat from my great grandfather, and she said, "You know, it's a Cars Mackinaw," and as if I knew what that meant. And I didn't know what that meant. So I years later, I looked it up. What was Cars Mackinaw all about? And here we have this next slide. This is a stamp or an embosser from the Cars Mackinaw company. And this symbolized, this was a company, they created work clothes. They sold the manufactured work clothes in Aurelia for the workers, outdoor workers, lumberjacks, farmers, hunters, fishing guides. And so it was a big business. And here we go. Look at that style. Isn't that something? Lots of pockets for ammunition and small game. And you had a little flap there to put the collar up in high winds. And unlike a hood, you could actually to move your head around and see your prey that you're going to try and shoot. Or if you're in a war zone, you can actually keep a good lookout for the enemy. So yeah, so lumbermen's and miners' clothing. And then later we see that the Cars Mackinaw company did a lot of outdoor clothing companies. They started marketing their Mackinaw coats to recreational athletes. And here we have an excellent photograph taken on Lake Couchiching in Aurelia, where they're wearing Cars Mackinaw coats in some of these cases here. And so, yeah, that was a very popular use for the coats. We see lots of photos online of different teams wearing Cars Mackinaw style Mackinaw jackets. The Cars Mackinaw company operated between 1897 and 1963. And they also sold their coats through the Hudson Bay Company. So the Hudson Bay Company would commission them to make a distinctive red coat with a black stripe, which you can see over your head right now, Lindsay. Yeah, we'll see that a bit closer later. And yeah, and I have another white coat. A slide coming up that will show you how short the coats would get for curling, because you wanted to have enough room for your to go into the squat for your slide.
That's right. So the Karst Mackinaw company really like locally helped to popularize this garment. And it became especially popular as somewhat of a uniform for lumbermen. So can you talk a bit more about that, please, John, that connection?
Okay, well, the thing about the Mackinaw coat was it was designed to resist cold weather. It was water resistant because it's wool, and it was very durable. So of course it would be used by outdoors people of all kinds. But what we saw in the later 1800s is that the mid 1800s onwards, actually in Ottawa was perhaps the earliest time, was in the 1820s. The lumber industry just took off, and you needed a lot of workers up there in the woods, dressed appropriately. So the nice thing about wool is it vents a lot better than skins do, and it is fairly water resistant and tough. And now the interesting thing about Karst Mackinaw was started by William Karst, who grew up in the Ottawa Valley, and his brother actually started a men's fashion shop, I believe, down in Cornwall. So this fellow here, this depiction is a fellow called Joe Montferrand, or Joseph Montferrand, and as some people might know him as Big Joe Mufferaw. And so this fellow was 6'4". He was from Montreal. He came from a family of big men. At the age of 16, he was invited to take on the Canadian boxing champion, and he knocked him out with one punch. And from then on, the legend grew. And this fellow lived on my side of the river in the National Capital Region in Hull. And he would often represent his French Canadian lumberjacks in battles with the Irish lumberjacks. So there's a lot of good stories about this fellow, and his legend was carried with the lumberjacks throughout the lumber areas. So, you know, lumberjacks would move around too, you know, and so some of them ended up going out west, and it's believed that this statue of Paul Bunyan was inspired by Joe Montferrand, or Big Joe Mufferaw, and Stomping Tom Corners, by the way, he has a good song about that, so I won't sing that. And but there you go, you have this this other person dressed in a similar way. It's important to know that that red-black stripe, it's called the buffalo check design, and that was part of the Mackinaw jacket design right from the beginning, as far as I know. And originally, when they were commissioned for Captain Charles Robertsman, they wanted blue coats, but they didn't have blue coats. They had this buffalo check design, and they had red, so that's what they got. And so can you imagine some people going into battle dressed like that? That would have been pretty stylish, you would think, for that time.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of folk heroes like Joe Montferrand, you have described the Mackinaw jacket to me as Canadian folk costume, and that's right on the title of your installation. So, John, why do you think the Mackinaw jacket qualifies as a Canadian folk costume?
I think the Mackinaw coat is a good folk costume for Canada because it's worn pretty well coast to coast. You see fishermen wearing it, or you see lumberjacks, you see hunters, outdoors people, you see it worn in urban centers, you see it all over the place. It's you know, it may have started out as a Métis and War of 1812 veterans garment, but it's been adopted in so many different uses, and it's something that was recognized as a folk costume by early British settlers in the Montreal area with the Montreal Snowshoeing Club, but also by the Governor General and his family. So it was clearly understood that this was part of a 400-year-old tradition. They may not have known the whole story, but it's an unconscious identity that we have with that coat. We're drawn to it, and it keeps remaining popular in generation after generation. It's something that reminds us of our ancestors and of a time when Canada was known as a place where lumberjacks and hunters and outdoors people would enjoy themselves. And what we see here is this advertisement this was around the turn of the century, perhaps, or maybe the 1920s, where they're trying to market the Mackinaw coat for urban users as well. And this happened around the time when in the turn of the century, the youth got into the Mackinaw coat. They started seeing it as a fashion item that they could claim. And when the youth got in it, then it just spread to all generations. So that you see the continued use going throughout the whole, through the 1800s and into the 1900s. And I would say it's a Canadian folk costume because you don't see people wearing capotes that much walking down the street anymore. And you might not see the ones with the sashes walking along the street, but you will see Mackinaw coats. And the Mackinaw coat was created and became popularized right around the time that, that Canada was becoming a nation. And as I said, that perhaps it may have been the Battle of Fort Mackinaw that was the spark that in which we recognized that that these different peoples needed one another to fend off a common enemy and to protect the land that they all care deeply about. So here we have a poster of different kinds of folk costumes you might see around the world, and so you get a sense of what is a folk costume. Well, you can imagine that people from around the world, when they see a Mackinaw coat, they instantly think Canada, and they may even think North America, because the Americans really appreciate it too, because where it was born was the overlap of Canada and America anyway. And for Indigenous peoples, we've never really, there weren't those boundaries in the old days. It was Turtle Island, as we call it today, or Mackinaw, as we might use that term as well. So here we have, I live just across the river from Ottawa, and this is our mascot for our CFL football team called the Red Blacks, which I will also do a shout out to Jackie and Diane Goodor, because their dad was the commissioner of the CFL back in the 70s and 80s and helped to resurrect that league. So anyway, we have this this mascot was originally going to be called Joe Muffraw, but there's a bit of an outcry on the French from the French community, so they just call him Big Joe. And anyway, it's kind of neat. It's part of the local lore. I mean, we had a lot of logging going on here. And this final slide here, you see me and my grandfather's curling Mackinaw coat with the white one. We see my cousin Dezunge and Asana, Paul Schilling, in my great-grandfather's Mackinaw coat. Just as a reminder that this coat was worn by First Nations as well, and as it would have been traded. And then there's my cousin Frank Kehoe, and there he is pointing to something. This is a great shot because he was just pointing at something. I don't know, he looks like he's a scout there in his own apartment, which is something. And I'm really, that's fantastic. And then this is a fellow I met Christmas shopping at Perfect Books in Ottawa. And Christopher, he was visiting his sister from Kelowna, and he was wearing his father's Hudson Bay Mackinaw coat. Now, this could have actually been made in Orillia by the Cars Mackinaw Company because it's from the 1960s. Nice thick one. And I thought, there you go. You got this young fellow, and he recognizes that this has style. I asked him, why he's wearing it. And he says, I just liked it. It was my dad's coat, and why not? So every generation is reclaiming this coat as part of their their fashion, and it really is part of the Canadian identity, which is the blending of these different influences that made the coat, but also made Canada.
Very cool. Now some of these coats are actually on display across from me. So I'm gonna switch to my other computer here. Very high tech, I know. And John, would you give us a little tour of the coats that we have on display?
Okay. Okay, so.
I'm going to try to move really smoothly so I don't cause any motion
Oh, okay.
sickness.
So this first one here, that's done in the, I think it's called the Queen Anne's stripes. That's associated with Hudson Bay Company a lot, but you see different blanket coat companies using that striping design as well. And this is basically a coat that's been, or a blanket that's been turned into a coat. So all parts of the blanket have been made into the coat. And I've actually worn that even on ice floes floating down the Ottawa River. We sometimes do that in the spring when the ice is thick enough, just to amuse the neighbors. So I've worn that one on those kinds of things, but it's very warm when you go snowshoeing through the woods. The other one, the red one, this is Cars Mackinaw's jacket. You see the little epaulets there on the shoulders. That's kind of a military flourish there. The collar that can be turned up when it's cold, and again, lots of pockets. I have another coat. I'll show you this later, but it actually has pockets that fit in the back where you can stick squirrels and rabbits even, or ammunition if you want. So that's something that my grandfather would have worn, something like that when he went fishing at Duck Lakes. I think that's called Lake Dalrymple now. And the coat to the right, that's my, as we're migrating there, that's my great grandfather Charles's coat, which my grandfather Joe also inherited. And that's a Cars Mackinaw as well. And there's the little embosser. And this is like Dr. Tongue from SCTV. I don't know if anybody knows that reference. And some of the panels that Lindsay and I developed, so that was nice. And then if you can turn around to the buffalo check one, this is like the coat that I inherited from my Aunt Mary Lou, a beautiful young woman who died too young. But anyway, I inherited that and I wore it for many years. Eventually I outgrew it and one of my girlfriends stole it from me. But anyway, or I gave it to her, I guess. So anyway, that's the one that a lot of people are familiar with as the Mackinaw coat. And, you see that kind of coat being worn by bands, rock bands or Marlon Brando and on the waterfront. There's different variations of it that are quite cool. I have, let's see if I can put this here. I have this Hudson Bay book. You can see some of they hired these designers to do updated versions of the Mackinaw coat and for women. So I think that's just, that's quite something.
That's great.
Okay, so I guess it's the question time, eh, Lindsay? We're gonna
There we go.
some questions. I have I know I sent out a lot of emails to people, so if people have questions, I'd be glad.
Sorry, folks. I saw people coming in saying you can't see the coat, so I apologize for that. I'll leave the.
Okay, well, in the meantime, while you get the questions going, I'll do a fashion show here. I'll show you one of my.
Oh,
this is sorry for the plaid on plaid, guys. That's a little bit. But this is kind of a more styled cut one. I'm gonna have to lose a bit of weight so I can fit it better, but I can still kind of wear it. Yeah. And this is the one this is the one where it has this pocket. And I was like, what an odd place for a pocket. Like, what are you gonna do? Stick your hands in your back as you're walking? Like, but no, that's for small game. I found an ad where they were advertising that the pockets could be used for small game. And So really, you could go walk in the bush, and if you you got hungry, you just reach behind you, grab a squirrel, and roast it up. Now, the other thing I think are kind of cool are these are Mackinaw shirts, they call them. So some people call it the Northern Tuxedo. So this is a Woolrich brand one, and I got it at Sporting Life on sale. So I'm really happy with that. So again, this doesn't have the pockets down here. So it's the difference between a shirt and a coat is it doesn't have all the pockets all the time like you would with the coat. It's a bit thinner. You could wear it under a coat, and it's something that I would probably wear around this time of year, except today when it was super hot, but when it's cooler. And this is the most recent Hudson Bay Mackinaw style coat. I got this in at one of their shops in Vancouver. It's basically a thin fleece with the buffalo check design. So the Mackinaw continues in different manners.
John, we've got a couple of questions coming in here.
Okay.
So we've got Susanna. She says, thank you for the terrific presentation. So thank you for being with us, Susanna. Two quick questions. The first one is a great question that I have not even thought of before. The Hudson's Bay Point blanket has 4 stripes of different colors. Do you know if these stripes have any meaning?
The band,
the big bands of color.
But the big bands or the small bands? So the big bands, I think that's just something that people liked, I guess. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is these blankets were designed for Indigenous people largely. So the colors and the stripes would have been what attracted them, and they would ask for that even. So that may even be lost in history for somebody to dig up in an archive somewhere, maybe in Britain, because a lot of these blankets were made in Britain and then brought over here.
Okay. And the other question from Susanna is, do you know what the approximate value of the Mackinaw blanket would be in today's money? Was it considered a luxury item? Was it an expensive trading item for First Nations people?
It's interesting in that, yeah, I remember reading about this, that they were expensive. You know, you look back on it and some people were saying, oh, they were ripping off the First Nations with the cost of the blankets. But actually, when you look at the cost of how much money it took to make the blankets in relation to how much time it took to do the trapping and the hunting, they found that actually it was a really good deal. In fact, it was the British workers that actually were getting ripped off in that whole transaction. That actually, it was economically the First Nations got the better of the bargain.
Interesting. We have a question from Debbie who says, how long was Karst Mackinaw producing the Mackinaw coat?
That would have been 66 years, from 1897 to 1963.
Nice. Good quick math. Okay, folks, if you do have other questions, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. John, I have one here that was submitted in advance as well from Janet, who says, I'm very curious to know how many locations we know of where the Hudson's Bay cloth blankets and coats were made. I am aware of a place near Whitney in Oxfordshire, England, from when I lived in England.
Well, the Whitney blankets were famous, yes, and they were used by Hudson Bay coat manufacturers. They would have been used by many blanket coat manufacturers, the Whitney one, but they were all over the place. And then the other thing too is Canada started developing its own uh, its own blanket uh, manufacturing industry as well. I know in Ottawa they had one here at the Rideau River where I sometimes go paddling. There's up in Mackinaw even they had a manufacturer of blankets up there too, which became known as Mackinaw wool. So these Mackinaw woolens actually were used for the manufacture of Mackinaw coats. There's a big manufacturing operation down in Chicago. There's one even out west now called Filson, and they still make them. Woolrich is another manufacturer. It's something where a lot of international manufacturers are coming on stream as well, using high quality wools from all over. The funny thing about it is, we look at the fur trade and we think Canada was founded on two fashion crazes. One was the top hat, the beaver felt top hat. Well, that wasn't so much worn by Canadians out there in the woods as it was by Europeans. So we shipped all that felt out to, or the beaver pelts out to Europe for them to make their own hats. And they shipped us the blankets that we made into our coats. So again, it's international trade back then, but Canada was founded on a fashion industry. And Aurelia, the significance of the Cars Mackinaw company is there you have resource extraction, which is the logging. And of course, it was destroying the First Nations hunting grounds and fishing weirs. But the industry of Aurelia started. Its manufacturing started with companies like the Cars Mackinaw company that were starting to manufacture products that they could sell around the world. So, I mean, you can find these coats, the Cars Mackinaw coat. If you go online and you do a search on eBay, you can find vendors of these coats all the way from Britain to Japan. It's quite amazing.
Wow. Well, that actually that answers Donna's question that's here, which is where could I buy an Aurelia made Mackinaw coat today?
Well, look for the Cars Mackinaw name. So that's CARSS. And you're going to be paying, if you're lucky, around $200, but you can pay as much as $700 for them. I would say a good price is somewhere around $400. It's kind of nice because you get to wear an artifact from your region that's warm. The color stays, look at the color of that. That's like 100-year-old jacket behind you, and it's still got that warm red color. And even when they fade, it's like the old Scottish tartans that fade. They have their own character to them as well. Now, I'd like to also, I know some people ask me about the importance of the Mackinaw jacket as regalia for the Great Lakes Métis. And I think this is very important to look at it as a symbol of the Great Lakes Métis. Now, the Great Lakes Métis are kind of a misunderstood people. Are there really Métis in Ontario? Some people from out west have said, especially in Manitoba, because there's different ways of looking at Métis. There's the Louis Riel's Red River Nation there, but before that, there was, or around the same time and a bit before, there was the Great Lakes Métis. And as I illustrated, they were involved in that battle in the War of 1812. And if it wasn't for that battle, all Métis would have been under threat in Canada from American expansion. So, there were Great Lakes Métis. They can be almost identified, they can be identified with this coat because they were there. It was designed by one of their own, and its distribution throughout North America or through Canada and part of the United States is an example of where the Great Lakes Métis ended up migrating. So some people say, well, there aren't any Métis from south of Sault Ste. Marie. Well, actually, a lot of them that were south of Sault Ste. Marie moved to Manitoba, but some of them also moved down to Penetanguishing and Aurelia area to set up fur trading operations.
Yeah. All right.
So I argue that if you're a Great Lakes Métis, you should have one of these coats in your closet and wear it proudly. And if you're a descendant of one of the veterans as well, like I am, of a non-Métis, my ancestor Antoine Godor was French Canadian. You should be proud too. If you're a British person, you should be proud of wearing one as well. I mean, many people can be proud of it. We can all adopt it as a folk costume, or our own regalia, and just recognize that it is the coming together of many different threads and peoples into one garment.
Very cool. Well, I mean, we can't end on a much better note than that, I don't think. So, folks, if you're interested in seeing this gorgeous installation from John, you only have until this Saturday to get into OMAH to see these jackets in person before the show comes down. So if you're in the Aurelia area, head our way. John, thank you so much for your knowledge and for sharing this story with us. And thank you to everybody as well who has joined us this evening. I saw several Godors in in the attendance list. So welcome to all of you and everyone else. So yeah, John, any parting words?
Well, I just want to thank Paul Schilling de Sangay, who painted these pieces over my shoulder. So thank you for that backdrop
And modeled this
model,
jacket.
yes. And I look forward to visiting all my cousins. Thanks to the museum when we held a family exhibit there that documented the first settlers of Aurelia, which were Antoine and Mary Schilling. I ended up with so many cousins down there, hundreds of them it seems. So now I have a great family to come back to and say hello. So I'm going to come down to Aurelia, and I hope I can get to see some of you when I pick up my coats and bring them back. And now I don't know what I'm going to do with all these coats, but anyway, maybe I can sell some online and you guys can buy them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. Thanks, everybody. And have a great night. Take care, everyone.